Here we go. Sea peoples of Canaan and the other Philistines. Let's get started here. We are still working on the Bronze Age collapse, and I'm not going to go through these details because I've gone through the intro several times. Needless to say, if you want to know more, I have an entire hour-long introduction to the Bronze Age collapse on my YouTube channel. But just for the very short version, the Bronze Age collapse, right? Well, the late Bronze Age was a high point in human history, and then it all came crashing down. So we have these powerful nations in Egypt and Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites in Turkey, and Mitanni in Syria, but then it all collapses. So this is what we call the Bronze Age collapse. We've gone through in detail the reasons for the Bronze Age collapse, but I've really been focusing on the last one, the one in red here, the invasion of the Sea Peoples. And the reason I've been focusing on that one more than any other has been that it's through the Sea Peoples that we can see an interaction between the biblical tradition, between the Jewish stories, between Jewish history, and then the Bronze Age collapse. It's really through the Sea People. So in our last lecture, we went through the Philistines in detail. We're actually going to talk about them again tonight. Don't worry if you haven't seen the last lecture. I'm going to give you the bare basics to be able to enjoy it. And then we're going to move on to a couple other Sea Peoples that are talked about in the Bible, but you probably never even realize they were there. And you'll understand why I'm saying that after tonight. So let's talk about the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples were these invading forces of various groups. We're talking about 9 different groups that have been named through the Egyptian sources, and I'm using that as my guide for us talking about the Sea Peoples. So our last lecture was on the Peloset, the Philistines, as you know them, or some people would say the Palestinians. I went through this in detail last time, but I still need to talk a little about the Peloset because it's through the Philistines that we can move on and talk about the other Sea Peoples that are in the Bible. All right, so let's first take a look. What else can we get from the Peloset, from the Philistines that I didn't already cover? So you saw this slide last time. And this slide right here is, I told you, I want you to remember these feather headdresses were the Philistines. Whenever we look at these reliefs, even if there's some exceptions to that, just remember these are the Philistines. We're now going to start covering later on some of the guys up here on top. But for right now, let's focus on the Philistines for a minute. Why the Philistines again? Well, we're laying the groundwork for the other Sea Peoples in the Bible. We're going to prove that there are other Philistines, and we're going to see and I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but the Philistines aren't just one people, and you're going to see that tonight. And by looking at both the Bible and archaeology, we're going to separate that out and not only identify who these people were, but where they were from. So explaining why the Philistines are listed in the Bible before the Bronze Age collapse. I got a lot of questions about why in Genesis, or Breshit if you prefer, do we see the Sea Peoples listed? In other words, we see the Philistines listed. If they didn't come until the Bronze Age collapse, why are the Philistines in there? So we're going to cover that too. That's actually probably the second most common question I got after my last lecture posted. So this slide is for the people that did not see the main Philistines lecture. This is going to give you the basics you need to enjoy tonight. So the Philistines in brief. The name Philistines is derived from Peloset, which is the Egyptian name for the group. In Hebrew, it's Peloset, so very close. Now this in Greek became the Philistines. In English, it's been really, and I talked before about this track of how it's this 2-track Philistines and Palestinians. Either way, I just want you to understand that this group that we're talking about is all the same people. All right. There are numerous references to the Philistines in the Bible. There's at least 250 and really much more than that. I've seen other numbers, 250, 289, 500, but needless to say, they're in there a lot. The most famous Philistine is Goliath, right? The famous story of David versus Goliath, which you can see in my main Philistine video. That's the real origin of the Philistines, Z11. That's if you want to know the details of David versus Goliath. Now, the Philistines were focused in the Pentapolis. So that's right here. This is in southwestern Israel, modern Israel. And these cities are still known today, right? Ashkelon is a city in Israel. Gaza is a city under the Palestinian Authority. Well, really, I should say it's under Hamas, but we don't want to get into that mess tonight, do we? But anyhow, so I just want you to see that these cities are still known today. They're readily identifiable where they are, and this was the center of where the Philistines were. Now, the Philistines lasted a long time. We can tell both from the biblical tradition and also from the archaeology. The Philistine people lasted almost 600 years, all the way until they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, about 604 BCE. So what we have been able to establish is the Philistines clearly came from the Greek world, all right? And we're going to talk about the individual countries in 1 second, but we've had DNA testing, we have the pottery, we have the artifacts from the archaeology, and we can see that the Philistines were heavily influenced by the Greek world. We can see from their DNA that they had that a minority of the Philistine people. In other words, when they checked there's a cemetery in Ashkelon that was found with the Philistines, and if I had to summarize that conclusion, what I want to say is there was definitely Greek DNA in that cemetery, but it was a minority portion of the DNA. Most of it was Canaanite. But nonetheless, we know both from the biblical tradition and from archaeology, the Philistines lasted about 600 years, although their DNA, the Greek DNA, only lasted a couple hundred years. We've also established that modern Palestinians are not the Philistines. And if you want the details of that, again, the real origin of the Philistines will cover you. So I left you with the cliffhanger last time. I said that Greek DNA, or AGN in general, DNA was diffused into Canaanite DNA quickly. So by that I mean what I just said a second ago, that there was identifiable Greek DNA, but it disappeared after a couple hundred years, even though the people would keep going another 400 years after that disappeared. Now, the complication was this Greek DNA was not from one country. So it'd be very easy if all that Greek DNA was from Crete, if all that Greek DNA was from Sicily, if all that Greek DNA was from mainland Greece, but it wasn't. It was from at least Greece, what's now Greece, Crete, Sardinia, and spots of of other places here and there. So it's very confusing. These are supposed to be the Philistines. They're supposed to be the one group, the Peloset, but hold on, there's multiple countries that their DNA is coming from. The lesson here is the Philistines were not just 1C peoples. Because of the Bible, we may call the Philistines 1C peoples, but the Peloset were not, that we identify as living in this pentapolis, were not just the Peloset. There were others there, all right? So what I want to focus on now is, who are these others? What makes up the others? And how did you have this mix of Greek people and Canaanite people? Really, the kicker of all this is, when you look at what the Bible says, we actually knew this all along. We just weren't paying attention. All right. Okay. So I'm going to start off with the biblical side, and then we're going to move into the archaeological side. All right. Let's see what we can get from the biblical tradition. All right. Now I want you to look at this middle panel right here that says the other Philistines. All right. Now I'm going to look at each one of these names. We have these Pathrusim. Look up here on the top left. The Pathrusim and the Pelusim went forth from the Philistines. Well, Rashi is explaining this to us. He's saying that the Philistines actually descended from these two peoples. In case you don't know who Rashi is, he would be widely recognized as the greatest Torah commentator ever born. His words are pretty respected, to say the least. So anyway, he has left us this message that the Philistines actually came from these two people. All right. Now, I'm going to put this all together. I just want to jump to the next one. We're going to look at these Avim. You see the Avim? The Avim were Canaanites. Why? It says that the Avim dwelt in the villages of Gaza, right? So Gaza is in the Pentapolis, but the Caphtorim actually displaced them. Now, I'm adding another name. What are the Caphtorim? Well, look at the next line. The Philistines from Caphtor. So the Philistines are identified as being from Caphtor. And we spoke about this last time, and what we came up with talking about the Caphtorim and the Cherethites were that these people were probably from the island of Crete, all right? And so what this is telling us, if we see from Jewish, Egyptian, and Akkadian sources that the Cherethim or the Caphtorim were from Crete, and the Philistines were attached to them. That would mean the Philistines have a special connection to Crete. There's one more I want to throw out here. If you look at the bottom, we also have the Pelosethites, which is phonetically very similar to the Peloset or the Peloset. And so this is another group of people identified as being with the Cherethites, right? And also being in the area of Goth. So what's happening here when you look at this is each of these quotes is telling us, hey, wait a second. These are other people that are clearly associated with the Philistines, but they don't have the name Philistine. So our lesson here is already the Bible is telling us the Philistines are made up of multiple people. All right. And then what I really like about it is it includes the Avim. So the Avim are Canaanite people, and it's telling the Bible is telling us that that Canaanite people also were included as part of the Philistines, as part of Philistia. Okay, so the lesson here is the Bible refers to all sea peoples as Philistines. All these people are at some point or another interchangeably used with the term Philistines, and that has warped our interpretation of who the Philistines are to this day, but it's right there in front of us. All right, now what I want to do is look at the geography for a minute. We're going to look at this map a few times tonight. Now, this map I used last time. It's really showing King Saul's wars, but it has all the right cities, and I like that it has Philistia here. So we're going to make this our main map for the evening. Now, there's a couple areas I want you to focus on. One is this yellow rectangle. Now, this yellow rectangle is where King Saul's wars were. Okay, so King Saul is fighting up here, which is very interesting because where was the Pentapolis? The Pentapolis was down here where the orange circle is. Very odd. Okay, and let's look here on the left. The battles here are 100 miles from Ashkelon or more, right? So here's the line about Shanim, here's Gilboa, here's Jezreel Valley, here's Beit Shean. They're all up here in this yellow rectangle, but Philistia is down here. Why would that be? Well, that would tell me there must have been other people in this area that are fighting the Israelites for control, because the Philistines would be fighting down here. They'd be fighting in this area. Why are they so far away from home? Well, that tells me there's other people around. Okay, so what I want to do is, now that I understand the Bible's telling me that they were fighting far from Philistia, and now that we have learned that there's a bunch of different people equated with the Philistines, it has just occurred to me, wait a second, multiple people are called Peloset, multiple people are called Philistines. How can that be? And so for that, I want to look at a little bit more recent history. Now, when I'm doing antiquity, recent history could be 1,500 years ago, but nonetheless, it's more recent. So let's look at some recent history. All right, now this map should be familiar to all of you. I want to look at England for just a second. Or should I say Great Britain? Britain got its name from the Brittany people, all right? But then it's also called, we also have England. Why is it Britain and England? Well, it's because you have the Angles there. So during the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the Saxons being Germanic, they would get a foothold replacing the Brittany. The Brittany actually fought the Romans, okay? And then 600 years or so after that, you have an Anglo-Saxon invasion. Oh, and that's not enough, because then a couple hundred years after that, you're going to start having the Danes coming. You have other tribes in the area, the Jutes, the Gaels. Oh, and in 1066, the Normans would depart France and take over the island for themselves, right? So we have the Norman invasion. So my point is, you have an instance here of, hey, look, you have the Brittany, you have the Angles, you have the Normans, you have the Danes, but we call it Britain and we call it England. So these two tribes who may have never been the majority are where we get the name of the country. A better example is France. France is named after the Franks. Who were the Franks? They were a Germanic tribe that took over France. So France was, their ethnic majority were actually the Gauls, right? When Rome ruled Europe, France was called Gaul. And even when the Franks came in, they were always a minority. They did rule, but they were always a minority, yet we still call the country France today after the Franks. We don't call it Gaul, which really would have been the much more fair and balanced name if we looked at what the Romans taught us. Now look at Germany. Germany is another one of these, like England, where it's just a bunch of different tribes, right? For the Deutschland is the German name for their own country, and it may have derived from the tribe, the Teutons, the Teutonic tribe, which was just one of numerous Germanic tribes. But Germany is made up of tons of tribes. Saxons, again, like we have in Great Britain, but also Franks, like we have in France, and the Thuringians and the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Frisians. Probably the Bavarians are the only of those last few you've even heard of. Yeah, we call it Germany. Now, I want to look at one more. This is Russia. Russia is another famous example where you have this minority people, right? Russia is really a Slavic nation. The majority of people are Slavs, and maybe Northern Slavs or Southern Slavs, several different Slavic tribes. Yet the Rus, these Viking invaders called the Rus, come into Russia, and we end up calling the entire country Russia over this minority people. So what I'm saying is, it's not so surprising that one particular group of people, one tribe, could get the name of the entire people. We've seen it numerous times, and of course, seen it most famously with the Jews, right? Where do we get the name the Jews? Well, there were 12 tribes, and the name Jew comes from the tribe of Judah. And even when you look at ancient Israel, you had the kingdom of Israel and you had the kingdom of Judah. So you have two different kingdoms. Even within the kingdom of Judah, you have 4 tribes. Of course, you have Judah, but you have Benjamin, you have Simeon, you have the Leviim. Yet we came to call the residents of the kingdom of Judah, of Judea, Jews, and then that came to include those from the north too. So all Israelites became Jews, and now the two terms are synonymous with each other. Just in case you're wondering, the first time Jew was used to specifically name someone from another tribe was in the book of Esther. So Mordecai, the hero of the book of Esther, was the first one to be called a Jew, even though he was actually of the Benjaminite tribe. All right. So my point in going through this very quick tour of world history is to say it's really not a big deal that the Philistines came to represent all the sea peoples in Israel. It's happened many, many times. This is one of many examples. So now what I want to do is move on and then compare what we've just learned with what we can get from the story of Genesis with Bereshit. So I said people were bothered by the fact that when you look at Bereshit, when you look at Genesis, which includes Abraham and includes Isaac, these Abraham's, depending on your dating, 400 years before Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt. So this is long before the sea peoples. This is therefore 400 years before the Philistines. So why is Abraham interacting with the Philistines? So I want to look at a couple of these lines from Genesis to see if I can make you feel a little bit better. I want to zoom in on this map right here. So I'm going to zoom in right where this square is. So here's just a blown up version of Philistia. And I want you to see that Genesis 10:19 is telling us that Canaanites were populating this area, and they were the one city we can readily identify here is Gerar. Okay, so Canaanites were in Gerar. Now I just want you to see this one panel here, but I really want to focus on the left side of the page. All right, so here's Gerar. What do we know about Gerar? It's a Canaanite city, but it's located in Philistia. All right, it's clearly located in what would later be called Philistia. It's ruled by a king named Abimelech. So let's look at Abimelech. Abimelech was, by the way, his name is very Canaanite, very Semitic. His name is "my father is king," is what it means. And you'll see many derivatives of Abimelech's in history. It's not just the one that I'm dealing with right now in Bereshit. You'll see it the name occur in Judges and Chronicles and the book of Ruth. All right. But who was the Abimelech we need to know about in Bereshit? This is the king of Gerar. All right. And he faced Abraham and Isaac. He now is going to touch off something else interesting, because what I want to know is, what are the names of the Canaanites, right? I know it says Philistia. I'm going to get to that in 1 minute. But what is the name of the Canaanites here? And this is where the Avim come in. I mentioned the Avim a couple slides ago. I'm going to mention them again. Now I want you to see the Avim dwelt in the villages in the vicinity of Gaza before the Caphtorim came from Crete. Wow, I just told you Caphtorim is the Philistines. So the Avim dwelt in the villages around Gaza before the Philistines kicked them out. Now here it says wipe them out, but we know it didn't. Why? Because if you look much later here in Joshua, Joshua is telling us, hey, what do you know? If you look at the territory where the Philistines are, one of the people still there are the Avim. So let me put this all together for you. It seems pretty clear that there were Canaanites living in Philistia before the invasion of the Philistines. In fact, we have even a better reference, because those of you who saw my Merneptah video, when I went through the Merneptah stela in detail, we know he fought Canaanites in Ashkelon. So it seems quite possible, maybe even probable, that the people, the Canaanites that Merneptah was facing was the Avim. So it seems that we have a name for the Canaanites here. We know who was here before the Philistines, but what you really want to know is, why were the Philistines in Genesis? Okay, so let's summarize. Gerar was a Canaanite town. They were probably the same Canaanites as the Avim. Gerar, or the Avim, was conquered by the Philistines, right? We just learned here. The Canaanites and other peoples in the region, though, are now referred to as the Philistines. We now know right here in Joshua, we know for sure by Joshua the sea peoples are there, but they're saying the Avim are still there in Philistia, yet they're calling this area the land of the Philistines. All right, so this tells us that the Philistines are mixing with Canaanites, and we know from the DNA, hey, guess what? It's true. We can see from the DNA today, as recently as tests that came out this year, that Canaanite DNA and Philistine DNA were mixed together. All right, so why were the Philistines mentioned in Genesis? Why were they mentioned during Abraham and Isaac, long before Moses was born? Well, that's because everyone agrees to this. The Bible had to have been written after Exodus, right? It was, some would time it right before the Jews came into the land of Canaan. That's the traditional Jewish timing. Even if it was during Joshua, even if it was 400 years later, it really doesn't matter what your dating is. Anyone's dating is going to tell you that the book was written after the Philistines were starting to settle in this area. And we can see from the terminology that Canaanites were there, but they're just using the term that people knew at that time, because already during still the life of Moses, this area would have been known as Philistia. So the Bible has just been written in a language that people understood at the time. So it gives the erroneous impression that the Philistines predate the Bronze Age collapse, but I don't think they do. I just think the Bible was written in a way for the people of that time to understand what's being said. Okay, so let me summarize what we've learned so far. The Philistines is the name for all the people in Philistia. The Philistines in the Bible include the Peloset, but also other Greek and Aegean nationalities as well. The Canaanites in Philistia are also called Philistines in the Bible, right? So there are Canaanites there in Philistia, but they're called Philistines as well. We saw throughout history, including very modern times, you could have one tribe in a country become the name of all those people. And then finally, I want to say the land of the Philistines was the place name in the area in the time of Moses and Joshua, and it can be used as a frame of reference, even if it's talking about a story that happened in that land earlier. Now, this is our next and final point. The Philistines include all sea peoples, even those outside Philistia. All right, let me say that again. The Philistines include all sea peoples, even those outside the region of Philistia. This means we have sea peoples in the north. This means we must have had sea peoples interacting with Amalek. And then there could very well have been Jewish sea peoples. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, if you just want to help our little history project here, feel free to like the video or subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to catching you next time.